Thank you so much for joining. It's a great pleasure. So I want to talk about something we do. We work with architects. Some of us aspire to be architects. Some of us probably were architects once upon a time. But I want to talk about the person, not the architecture that we often plan to create. So a lot of these things can apply to beyond being an architect. What if I'm a team leader? What if I'm a technical person leading the effort in developing software? So I want to talk about the qualities of being an effective architect or a strong technical person. But when I say the word architect, what comes to your mind? You close your eyes and you imagine this architect. What I hope doesn't come to your mind is this architect from the Matrix. That's a terrible architect, isn't it? Because that architect is arrogant, feels like they know everything. That's not the kind of architect we want to really be. We want to be a better architect. But this brings memory to years ago. I was in a conference and we were doing a birds of feather session, and it so happened that I had the opportunity to organize this with a friend of mine. And so he and I were on the stage next to each other. And one of the very first questions from the audience was, what do you think of architecture and architects? And without missing a beat, immediately I said, oh, I hate architects. And the minute I said I hate architects is when I realized my good friend was actually a chief architect in a company. So I quickly took steps away from him in case he decided to throw a punch. And he looks at me and says, so you hate architects, huh? I said, yeah, I do, fearing for my safety at this point. And he said, I'm a chief architect in the company he was working for. And he said, I also hate architects. That was a relief. So, but then he went on to talk about, what his feelings are about architect. And he mentioned an amazing article. And I often recommend this article for developers to read, but also to reread. I tend to read this once in a few years just to refresh my memory, get remotivated. That article is an amazing article by Martin Fowler, and this article is called Who Needs an Architect? I won't spoil the thrill of this article for you by repeating what's in there. I don't want to do that because I want you to read it or reread it, but it's a great motivation to think about what are the qualities we want to carry around as being an architect in a team. And there are some really nice things he talks about based on the architects that he has worked with and he respects along the way as well. But I want to focus on what I would like to call as 12 qualities of being really good architect or a team lead or a person working with the team. So I want to count down in here about number of qualities I want to focus on. The first one is be a mentor, not a tormentor. And being a mentor, it's easy for us as we grow in our capabilities, as you gain experience and you're focused so much on the knowledge you are gaining, sometimes it's easy to forget where we once came from. And things are obvious, things are easy now, you're challenged by the environment. But what about those people who are in the situation that you and I were only a few years ago, maybe a few decades ago? And sometimes we tend to forget it. And if we forget to be a mentor, that's going to be really a problem in general. So one of the key things to consider is to nurture others in the team is a professional responsibility. Now, this reminds me of an experience. I'm a consultant, so I go around, work with different teams on software technologies. And as a consultant, I switch between teams very often. I would work with the team for a week. I'll go away, work with another team, come back in 2 or 3 weeks. Hey, how are things going? Let's review what we have done. And one of those trips, I came back, and one of the developers came to me and said, hey, I had a bunch of questions I wanted to get answers for. I wrote them down, and I was waiting for you to come back. So we sat down, went over the questions, and when we finished it, I said, really good questions. I'm glad you wrote them down, but I do have one question though. Your architect is way more knowledgeable than I am, knows the application, knows the domain, knows the technology. I'm just curious, why did you not ask your architect? Why did you wait for me to come back to answer those questions? And the developer looked surprised and said, you mean I would go ask my architect? And I said, yeah, why not? And the developer said, well, maybe you haven't listened carefully because every question we ask starts with an answer, are you stupid? So we don't really ask our architect for any help. And I realized how terrible that is when you have that knowledge, when you have that capability, but you don't have the willingness or the ability to nurture the team so they can actually grow. That's something we need to be very careful about. But you may say, all right, Venkat, that's a great idea. I want to bring my team's capability up. I want to help them grow. But what's in it for me? And let me be honest about it. It's perfectly okay to be selfish. We are not Mother Teresa. We are not here to make the world better without any gains on us. So it's perfectly a good question to ask, what's in it for me? Why should I help the team to grow? What is in it for me? And the simplest answer I can think of is, if I give you $10 right now, I'm going to be poorer by $10. But if I share with you what I know, you're going to ask a question in return. And even if you don't ask a question, when I'm saying something, your face is going to look like, what in the world is this stupid guy talking about? And I'm like, oh, so I'm not explaining in the way that it makes sense. Maybe I don't understand it enough to really explain it. And my mind processes, and within a few minutes, not only are you educated, I am more educated as well. So knowledge is the only wealth I know that grows when it's given. I can give you money, I become poorer. I give you knowledge, we both become richer immediately. So this is one of the reasons why it's important to, when people say knowledge transfer, that's stupid. You don't transfer the knowledge. Where is it? It's not with me anymore. Right? You never transfer knowledge, right? You share knowledge and you grow and you build. So when somebody says transfer knowledge, you're like, okay, there's emptiness over here, right? That doesn't happen. So essentially, knowledge is the only wealth that grows when it's given. And that's one of the reasons why you really want to be a mentor. You raise the team, you feel like you're working with smart people. And at the same time, of course, you're becoming smarter along the way as well. Now, that's great so far. But then when you're working with the team, keep in mind, we are emotional creatures. We are thinking constantly. We have ego, which is good, right? If you don't have ego, you can't get up from the bed. You need to have ego. But you don't want to have ego to the extent where your mind is like, I'm the best person around. You want enough ego to have self-confidence, but not too much of it. Well, but sometimes what happens though is, we get tangled up. Oh, it's my idea. You don't want to use it. I'm going to defend against it. And when we bring that emotion into it, it messes up with our progress. So one of the key things to keep in mind when discussing is to clearly separate two things. One is to criticize the ideas, but not the person. And that fine line is extremely important. If I ask you, well, we are talking about using concurrency in this point, but how do we deal with race condition? That's a good question. You are criticizing the idea of using concurrency. But if I instead say, well, you want to use concurrency, that's kind of stupid. How do you deal with race condition? Now I'm putting you on the spot, not concurrency on the spot. When we talk about these things, I'm not perfect at all. But anytime I can, I ask the question, what if I use the word we instead of you? It's not your idea, because I'm not going to criticize your idea. Hey, we are planning on using concurrency. That's great, we want better performance. But I wonder, how do we deal with race conditions in this case? And you might say, well, Venkat, everything is immutable data structure. Well, duh, I don't look like a fool after all, right? So we can have these kinds of discussions to separate it out. But the question really is, how can we get towards it? One of the key things to realize and keep in mind is, architecting is full of trade-offs. You're not selecting ideas. You are juggling between what can work without falling apart on another direction. So you are constantly trying to balance things out. So you may be focused on getting performance, and the other person is like, hang on a second, you can't go too much on it because we need scale as well. So when you're trying to manage scalability, you have to compromise on performance. So when multiple people work together, we remind each other of that balance we need to strike so we don't go overboard thinking about one little thing. So realizing it's a full of trade-off that we need to focus on in discussions. So when it comes to selecting ideas, we need to ask the question, how do we really know what we are selecting is really good? One of the dangers often is, I like using this technology, I used it in my last company, this is the only thing I'm really good at, and this gives me advantage, so I'm going to decide this is the right technology. That's dangerous, because we should consider what is good for the application being developed and other details involved in it. So if, for example, if we want to decide what front-end framework to use or what back-end technology we want to use, how do we make that decision? One approach we can take is this idea called debating with knives. So the idea of debating with knives, be a little careful, don't use real knives for this. So a debating with knives idea is, you sit around a dinner table which is circular, you have people sitting around it, and people have the knife one facing away from them, and the next person has the knife facing towards them, and we alternate it. So the person next to me has the knife facing away, I have the knife facing towards me. And now we are asking what technology we should use. And I'm going to speak in favor of a technology because the knife is facing towards me, I'm defending it. The other person next to me, the person next to me is going to speak against it. They're going to say why we shouldn't really use it. This goes on for several minutes, and then we flip the knife now in rotation, and I need to speak against it, and the person next to me should speak in favor of it. Now here comes the challenge. If I can only speak in favor of something, what does that mean? I drank the Kool-Aid, and I cannot think of why this may not be a good thing. If somebody is only speaking against it, what's that called? Bias. And we want a balanced approach. So I always say, tell me 3 things in favor, tell me 3 things that you don't like or what should be improved. Now we have a balanced argument to have. Now, surprisingly though, this is something we can train ourselves quite early on. My children are grown up now, but when they were little, this is kind of scary when children can jump on it. And we would tell them, if you want us to buy something, you need to tell us why we should buy it, but you should also tell us why we may not have to buy it. And they are just absolutely shocking. They would present reasons as to why we shouldn't buy, and your just heart absolutely melts when the children have reasons as pros and cons, and they can really pick up this discussion. And so they always think about, what is it for me and why maybe we shouldn't do this? It gives you a nice balanced approach. So when we start thinking about the pros and cons, we think about the ideas much more deeply and trying to remove the emotions from it. So we talked about 2 things right now. We said be a mentor, not a tormentor. We talked also about criticizing ideas and not people. But going a little further, one of the things I like to follow is to guide and not to dictate. When you are an architect, it's very natural to become really impatient. I know exactly how to do things, and boom, I'm going to tell you how to do it. And here you go, that's how you follow. And now we have a command structure, and that's a dangerous situation to be in. Because what you want as an architect is not the architecture. What you want as an architect is a team behind you creating that architecture. Why? Because that is reducing the risk. When things don't work, you don't want to be the person standing alone with everybody is like, this dude said do this, right? You want the team to validate your ideas. You want to bring them together. But one real good way to do that is to really guide the team, not to dictate it. But I'll tell you, there are 2 sets of people that scare me the most. Those who cannot follow instructions and those who can only follow instructions. Both these groups are dangerous, because the first group who cannot follow instructions, you tell them what to do, you go away, you come back, and they're just still stuck where they were. They're like, what happened? I gave you the instructions. It didn't work. Well, if it didn't work, why don't you ask for help? Why don't you improvise? Why don't you try things? The other group is even more dangerous. They do things and it's on fire. You're like, what happened here? Well, you told me to do this, so I did it, right? That's a dangerous group as well. But usually this happens not because that person is stupid. Usually this happens because that person doesn't feel empowered. And you need to ask the question, why are not people taking charge of things and moving forward? They lack empowerment oftentimes. And that is really coming down to the culture in the team we need to really think about. So we need to ask the question, how can people take and lead off things? But one of the key things to keep in mind is this, and I do this quite often honestly because I'm selfish, like I said earlier. And this happens so often, but I'll give you one example of this. A developer sat down with me, we had a discussion about a particular design, and the developer said, hey, thanks for all that input, but how do I solve this particular problem? And I said to the developer, I know exactly how to do it, but I won't tell you. You need to go away and time box for an hour. Spend an hour on it. If after the hour you cannot find a solution, come back to me and I'll give you the solution right away. And it only took about 25-30 minutes. I was walking down the corridor when the developer said, oh, by the way, thanks for that input, I solved the problem. I said, wow, that's great. That was only about 25-30 minutes. Tell me a little bit about how you solved it. And he went on to explain how he solved it. And I said, I'm so glad I didn't tell you how to solve the problem. And he said, why? And I said, because your solution is way better than what I knew. And I learned something I did not know before. And this is one thing I always want to give as a benefit of doubt. What if there's a better solution than I know? And I have to tell you, there are a number of times that is actually true. Because they come back with solutions, I'm like, whoa, I didn't even know you could do that. That's way better sometimes. Or other times, good try, buddy, but let's go back and change it again. That's not a good idea because of these reasons, but we are learning together. And that's one of the things. Otherwise, we are dumping them down. Let me tell you how to exactly do it. Fine. And what did we do? We just did not improve our skills or find new, better solutions. So guide them, but not to the point where you tell them exactly what to do. You want that little tug where you give them a little bit and then you catch up with them and you keep moving forward. So you may discover things from this experience that you didn't even know exist, and that's highly important as well. But I'm a huge fan of working with others. Again, the selfish nature of me, right? I want to learn from others as much as others can learn from me. But in that regard, I would say practice collective ownership. Now, sometimes we are very territorial. We draw a line. This is my code, that's your code. You better not touch my code. No wonder there is code smell when nobody else comes around you, right? They cross, what's that smell? Never mind, I'll just stay here. We are territorial, and that doesn't make any sense in developing applications. So I'm a big fan of really being a collective ownership. Anyone who is willing and able to change code should be able to change code as long as they can take responsibilities for the things they change. But there are some really useful reasons to do it. One of them is, as a project manager or as a company, ask the question, what's the risk for you when people don't take collective ownership? Well, let's say for a minute, John over here is really good at writing a piece of code. We keep giving John this code to write over and over and over, and guess what? John is absolutely fast in writing the code. And as a project manager, I'll ask you, how are things going? And you say, it's absolutely amazing. The speed at which my team is writing code is brilliant. That manager's words is like turkey the day before Thanksgiving. You say, how is it going? They've been feeding me more, right? And the next day is the slaughter. John quits, and what happens? Nobody can maintain the code anymore. And you tell the team, you guys did really well when John was here. Yeah, because nobody understands John code anymore. And we're looking at John's code and our head is spinning, nobody can maintain it. This, by the way, has a technical name for it. It's called the truck factor. The truck factor is the number of people on your team who should be run over by a truck for your project to fail. And what is that number on a lot of projects, unfortunately? 1. That's kind of scary, right? This actually happened in a project I worked on. And if this person was killed by a truck, given the situation, we would have been happier. But he won a lotto. And he said, I don't have to work anymore. And he leaves the building, and the rest of us were suffering after that, right? So you don't want the truck factor. You want people to just chip in and start moving forward. You may not be at that high speed, but you could be maintaining. The word I always look for in agile development is not fast, it's not speed, it's sustainability. Can I sustain the pace of development over time? Collective ownership can give you that. But this reminds me of an experience I had in a company in Europe. I cannot mention the name of the country right now, or the company, because I say one, you'll know the other. And I have an NDA, so I won't say it. But I was in the room, this was a few years ago, and there were 2 people sitting in the room. The manager was on one side, and the manager was asking, I want help on my new project. Which one of you can help? And both of them are like, nope, I will not. The other person, no, I will not. I will not. Like, he was like, why? And the developers are like, we are working on this project. We cannot work on anything else. We need to continue working on it. And I couldn't just bear with this anymore. At some point I interrupted and said, excuse me, sorry, I need to understand this. And I looked at those 2 people right in front of me and said, what do you work on? And very proudly he said, both of us sit next to each other in the company. And we both work on the same product. And he proudly with a smile says, I write half the code, he writes the other half of the code. I said, really? And do you ever touch the code he writes? No, and he better not touch mine too. And I looked at him and said, but I'm sorry, with all respect, what if you go out and you get hit by a truck tomorrow and you die? What happens? And he immediately said, he dies with me. This is scary, isn't it? The product cannot survive anymore because you have a territorial ownership on the code. And this is kind of scary, but he was okay with it, right? And I said, you got 70,000 people working in your company, and only the 2 of you can ever maintain this code? You're like, yep, isn't that cool? No, it cannot be cool, right? You need to have collective ownership. That's very important. So I know only one way of writing readable code. Ask a colleague to read it. If somebody tells me, I write readable code, I say with respect, who has read it? Nobody. Well, then your code is not readable. It's a myth. When somebody else reads it, what do? They kick, they scream, they cry, they crawl, and then they're like, let's refactor this code now. So it's dangerous to have somebody who keeps writing code, but nobody else really does it. So it's important to reduce that risk on projects. The next thing I want to talk about here is to allow developers to figure it out. You say, wait a minute, isn't that kind of like the guide don't dictate? It is, but taking this to a little bit further level, but allow developers to figure it out. Sometimes we are developing applications where there's a lot of unknown. If you ask me, what is programming? Have you ever seen this ever in your life, in your experience? You go to a programmer and say, we need to build this. They say, step away. They take a deep breath and they code it and say, there you go, it works, and they walk away. Has that ever happened? No, right? They sit there and they're like, what does this code do? They type something, damn it, that doesn't work. And then they change something here. That still doesn't work. They're trying to do something more. Is that our journey? Is that our life? So to me, programming is a series of mini experiments where we convert a series of unknowns to a series of knowns. That's what we do for a living. We don't walk into a building knowing what we are doing, except don't tell that to the boss, right? We try to figure this out, and that's our life, that's our journey every single day of our lives. But if we don't gain the expertise to figure things out, how are we going to get better at doing things? So it's important for developers to figure things out. But one very important part of that is that it should be extremely safe to be honest. Now imagine this for a minute. Let's say I sit next to you and we start talking, and within a few minutes I say, you know what? I don't know who hired Sarah. I was working with Sarah last week. My gosh, she's terrible. She doesn't even know about data structures and algorithms. I have no clue where she went to school. What are you thinking in the meantime? You're thinking, wait, let me understand this. Venkat worked with Sarah and is bad-mouthing Sarah. Now I'm working with Venkat. I wonder what he's going to say about me to other people. Let me be quiet. What just broke is our communication. Why? Because I broke your trust. So it's very important to keep that in mind, because if we build good trust, we're going to communicate really well. So the key here is, I know a few things, but I don't know a lot of things. And guess what? You know a few things, even things that I don't know. But there are things you don't know either. But together we can learn from each other. So it doesn't really help for me to go around and say, I don't know what he doesn't know. Well, no, that's not going to help anybody. So we need to build an environment that's very safe for us to work together. And so funny how some ideas go from brilliant to stupid within minutes of prototyping. This was me on July 13th, 2019 at 6:30 a.m. or 5:30 a.m. Well, I was working on a piece of code and I really wanted to find a way to implement this design. I was struggling with it and I just couldn't really understand how to implement it. I read an article early in the morning and immediately I'm like, whoa, this is amazing. You know why? This article, the author said how great this idea is. I'm reading. Oh my gosh, this solves every bit of my problem. How wonderful it is. But I'm old enough to know not to take ideas and implement it. Because the last time I did this when I was a young developer, my company wasted 3 weeks of their time because I did not take the time to figure out whether it actually works. So I immediately said, wonderful article, thank you author, amazing, but I'm going to write a prototype. I started writing a prototype. Within 5 minutes, I found all the things that don't work that the author never mentioned in the article. And that's when I tweeted this out of frustration, right? Within a few minutes, you can go from brilliant to stupid in minutes. But this is another lesson I want to share with you. This was a few years ago. I was working on a project with a gentleman named Stuart Halloway. He's a committer behind the Clojure language these days. Stuart is one of the most brilliant people I know. And I just joined this project. I've been working on it for a few weeks. I joined the project and I was starting to write code and I went to Stu and said, Stu, there's a better design for this particular code. Now Stu is a lot more smarter than I am, very capable, has been on the project for a lot longer than I just came in, has spent a lot of time on the code. And here I walked in and said, Stu, there's a better design. Stu could have looked at me and said, Venkat, why don't you go back to your desk and get the coding done, right? I don't have time for it. But instead he looked at me and said, what's the idea? I said, well, the code is doing this one, but I think this is a better design. And he looked at me and said, how much time would you need to quickly prototype this? Oh, I'll need an hour. And he looked at me and said, your hour just started. I want to see what you can show. I'm like, wow. He didn't reject the idea. He wants me to prototype it. So I rushed back to my desk. I started prototyping it. 15 minutes went by. I went back to him and said, I'm done with my prototyping. He said, you wanted an hour. In 15 minutes, you got it done. What did you find? I said, I found that I'm stupid. And he looked at me and said, no, that's not what I asked you. Tell me what you found in the design. And I said, here are the reasons why this alternate design looks like a great idea. And here are the reasons why it's terrible when you start implementing. And I laid out the details. And he looked at me and said, I really wish that had worked for you. But you tried. What do you think we should do? I think we should continue with the design we have. He said, let's keep going then. But then I realized something absolutely brilliant. Just think about this for a minute. What he just did is put himself through an opportunity where he can get a better solution out of this experience if there was one, or he got a validation that the solution they have is actually pretty darn good. When you start seeing things that way like he did, it changes the way you look at things. Every opportunity is an occasion to learn or to validate. There's no loss here, period. Because when you let people go discover things, either they come back with something better for you to move forward, you are now more enriched, or they validate it saying, what you're doing is actually pretty darn good, let's keep going. Both of that is absolutely useful. And of course, he never went to anybody and said, at least to my knowledge, right? Well, Venkat is stupid, he tried this idea. But that also empowered me to work more motivated in the team because my ideas were still useful and I had the freedom and the liberty to try things out. And that is extremely important as well. So time box your efforts. Tell your team, let's spend an hour on it. Let's spend 15 minutes on it. Let's spend a day on it. Pair with this other person, go explore, come back and share your learning. Let's see where we are going. We gain a lot more by giving the time, but time box your effort. Not 3 months of effort, right? Whatever the reasonable time is, schedule that for time boxing. Focus on the outcome, not on the process. A lot of times we get really hung up on, hey, this is the way to do things. There is no such norm. Innovation doesn't happen linearly. People come up with ideas and they are like, oh, look at what we can do here. We tried this and here's something that's working. So look for the outcome. That's the most important thing. And again, prototyping beats any arguments. I've seen teams do this over and over and over. They go to a conference, an event like this, they learn a new solution. The worst thing you can do going back to work on Monday is to tell people, I heard something absolutely amazing. It's the next best thing since sliced bread. We all should use it. And everybody is like, get out of here. Because you are threatening them at this moment by saying, I'm going to use something that I heard about and what we are doing is not going to be useful. Instead, don't try to sell them the sugary drinks, right? If you believe that you heard, I can't tell you how many times people come to me and say, I know this is great. How do I convince somebody else? I say, stop right there. You're not going to convince other people because you truly are not yet convinced. You are infatuated with something, but that's different from being convinced. If you truly want to be convinced, develop a prototype of what you learned. When you develop a prototype, you get to the details of, yeah, the speaker talked about all these wonderful things, but here are the good things and the drawbacks. And you are developing your experience on those things. You have things that don't work really well, you go find answers. Then you take the prototype, show to the team and say, play with it. Now you get the buy-in because you're not talking about stuff, you're showing them what actually works with the pros and cons in it. But of course, take the time to gain the domain knowledge. Now you say, wait. As a senior developer, as an architect, I got to learn so many things about so many technologies, and now you are telling me I should go learn about the domain as well. Unfortunately, how can you be effective as an architect if you don't know what you're building? And here comes the challenge, right? We want to build things, but what is that one thing we often struggle with? Extensibility, isn't it? Extensibility is a slippery slope. Why is extensibility a problem? If you anticipate really well, you got extensibility. If you anticipate poorly, you got code complexity, which kills you in the end. And you wanted extensibility, but you are further away from it because of the things you started building. This is dangerous. So for building extensibility, you need to be able to anticipate really well. But how do you anticipate really well? I hope you would agree with me. In every team, there are 3 kinds of people. You know whom I'm talking about. Just think about your own team. You will immediately remember these names as I mentioned these 3 groups. The first group of people, who are those? Those who are really good in software development but don't know anything about the domain. You know who those people are, right? They can write code. You tell them, I want to implement this, I'm done. What about the domain? I don't know anything about it, right? These are people who know software, nothing about the domain. The second group, those who know domain but not software. They know banking, they know taxation, they wrote Fortran code back in school, they think they know software development, they don't. They're good in the domain. Then the small group of people, those who know the domain and the software really well. I can see it in your face, you're thinking, Venkat, there's a fourth group. We'll politely ignore them, right? So essentially, these are the three groups of people in companies, isn't it? But the third group, if you ask me, Venkat, in all your years of effort, do you know who those people in the third group are? I will tell you their name right now over my 35 years of programming. I know them by the name, I still remember them. You know why? Because they are very few in every company. In your own company, it's very easy to find them. When you're in a room like this, if you want to know who they are, signal to somebody to turn off the light. These are the people who glow in the dark. Very few people who have this capability, right? Know the domain and also know software really well. It's that group that can predict this. You know, I'll be honest about it. I'm a programmer. That's what my profession is. That's what I got trained for. I never really liked chemistry. I don't think I even passed chemistry back in school. And one of my first jobs, I had to work with chemical engineers who were people who created algorithms. It's kind of vexing, by the way. I would look at a chemical engineering book on the desk. I would look at this and say, hey, look, this person has the same name as you. Was that your father? And the person would look at me and say, no, that's me. It's kind of scary, right? You're working with people who wrote the algorithm. But these were the nicest of the people. I would go to them and say, hey, I'm writing this code. I'm going to make it extensible. I want this to work with any chemical in the world. What do you think? And I'm so glad I asked them, because they would look at me and say, Venkat, if you ever did this, it'll break the law of physics. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I asked. Or they would say, good thought, Venkat, but we only work with hydrocarbons. These other chemicals don't exhibit this behavior. I'm sorry, I don't have a clue what that means, but I'm so glad I asked them. So if you want to build extensibility, you got to work closely with them. So the group 1 and 2 are the most popular, ignoring 2 and 3, I'm sorry, 3 and 4. The first two groups have to work closely with each other if you want to really plan extensibility. Otherwise, we build complexity, not extensibility. Look at your own experience. Look at the years you've been developing software. How many times you said, I want to build to make it extensible. And you're like, when is that going to happen? Never. And then you have a code that is sitting with you that is never going to be used. And I often say this only partly jokingly. Code is like people on a crowded train. If you have a crowded train, what's the problem with it? A lot of people are in the train, more people cannot get in, and people there cannot get out. Code is like that. The more code you have, the harder it is to get more code on it. And so minimalistic design is something very important, so we got to be careful how we evaluate extensibility. But part of the problem with what we do is we have to take the time to learn to unlearn. When I work with developers, when we want to change the way we do things, when we want to bring in new ideas, they say, well, I have experience. Yeah, that's the problem. Because we know exactly how to do things, but it's part learning, but a part unlearning. Learning is easy, but unlearning requires very deliberate effort. And we have to calmly sit down and say, I want to change the way I do this. So I'm going to change my practices. This is why learning a library, learning a syntax is easy. A paradigm shift is really hard, because a paradigm shift requires changing our thinking, not just adding things to what we do. So it's important to be able to take the time to unlearn as well. It's a deliberate activity we need to follow. But also diversify your knowledge portfolio. If you ask me, what is one of the biggest risks we run into? The better we are, the terrible we are in changing. The worst word in our field is the word called comfort. Comfort zone is terrible. Because when I'm comfortable, what happens? When you are a graduate, you just graduated from school. How does it feel to be a graduate from school? You are standing. Somebody says, hey, look over there. You're like, yes, yes. You're moving around. And you work for 5 years. What's that called? It's called experience, which means you're sitting. It's comfortable to sit, isn't it? 10 years means this. You're on the floor. And somebody comes to you and says, I got an idea for you. Don't bother me. I'm just comfortable right now. This is the worst position to be in because you're not agile anymore. You are dormant. Don't bother me. I don't want to get up. And that's the problem we get into. What if you make yourselves uncomfortable every single day? What if you make a fool out of yourself for 15 minutes every day? Then your body doesn't become dormant. Your mind doesn't become dormant. You don't say, I know this stuff. Don't bother me with this. I want to become a manager very soon. And then I can retire my life into eternity, right? But what if we make ourselves uncomfortable every single day? So diversify the knowledge portfolio. This reminds me of one experience. I was teaching a course for a group. So the pragmatic programmer says we should learn a new language every year. By the way, when they say new language every year, let me tell you what they don't mean. They don't mean, I know Java, I'm going to learn C#. No, that doesn't cut it. The language you learn should make you cry, should make you beg, should make you scream, make you call your mom and tell her, Mom, this is hurting. And she says, kid, keep going. That's how you grew up, right? You want, if a language doesn't make you think differently, you picked the wrong language. You want a language that makes you think differently, to program differently, to exercise a different part of your brain. I was teaching a course in a company. There were two people in front of me. They both about the same age. They graduated about the same time. At that time when I was teaching, they both were older than me. I think they still are. And these two people, one of them has programmed in 10 languages. The other one in one language. And in the week I was teaching, I would show an idea. The person on my right would say, whoa, 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 hang on. Go back to that one. How is this different from this language, that language? How does this work? What's the semantics? And I was like, wow, that's a great question. And the person next to him is like, why do you do this to me? I was fine writing this code. Now you're telling me to do everything different, not fair. And I was amazed. And that's when I tweeted this. I said, the amount of time you need to learn something new is inversely proportional to the number of different things you have learned in the past few years. Your enemy is familiarity. Your enemy is comfort. If somebody says, I'm good at it, stop. Don't continue on that. Go learn something different and see yourselves kick, scream, cry. You are taken from this expert to a novice. And then you begin your journey again towards expertise. And when you do this, your brain, your mental muscle continues to be active. And why? Because now I can pick up things very quickly when things need to be picked up, and that's very important. So learning happens in deltas, and you want to continuously move through it. I got a couple of more to cover, and I'll finish it. Lead by example. Don't try to, I was in a company where the architect said, hey, you all should write unit testing. But he never wrote a unit test ever in his life. And the team is like, we don't know how to do it. You all should do it. Imagine you being a leader where you can roll up your sleeves and say, let me show you how this works. If you don't do it, how could others do it? How do you expect others to do it? So I often say, architectural committee is where innovation goes to die. I was working with a team where they had a lot of architects. They never did anything. These are very dangerous people. I have a name for them. They are called the PowerPoint architects. Very dangerous people. So you need to really be careful about it. This is kind of like teaching children, right? When my children were young, I told them, you should brush your teeth before bed. Thanks, Dad. But when you brush your teeth before going to bed, they're like, oh, thanks, Dad. I'll be back after brushing my teeth and you can read a story for me, or Mom, right? So they learn from what we do, not from what we say. Same thing as a leader in a team. That's very important. So a good architect preaches, well, practices what they preach. That's very important. And write code. You know, in some companies, the word architect means I don't write code anymore. That's dangerous. Because if you don't write code anymore, what happens? You're so detached from reality. You're making all these technical decisions and everybody's like, why in the world are we doing this? That wouldn't work. And don't be this PowerPoint architect. PowerPoint architects are the dangerous people because they'll draw pretty pictures and before anything really gets done, they will quit, go on to draw PowerPoints in another place. You don't want that. I would rather have a practicing architect, not a PowerPoint architect. But also, one of the problems in our field is, by the way, I hate two words in English. Those are called best practice. Quit saying it. Terrible words. What does best practice mean? I don't want to think. I don't want to work on anything. You gave me a list, I followed it. If it doesn't work, it's your problem. Best practices are terrible. Context matters. Will this work now? Will it work in 6 months? And one of the key things I want to think about is every technical decision has an expiration label. Think about it this way. Here's a nice way to teach this to your team. If your team of architects are talking about stuff that's old, doesn't work anymore, I got an idea for you. Buy a can of milk. Put that outside, don't put it in the refrigerator for 2 weeks. Take this can to work with a glass. When they are talking, open this can of milk and you pour it. You know what's going to happen, right? It won't flow. It'll do cluck, cluck, cluck. And they'll stop and say, oh my gosh, what's that? You said, that's your technical decision you're talking about, right? It's stale. It's outdated. It's expired. Anyone wants to have a cup of milk? Well, that's what we've been feeding people, right? I'm sorry for the gross example, right? I can see in his face, oh my gosh, he's imagining this, right? No. But the point is, every technical decision has an expiration label. It's no longer valid, maybe. We need to reevaluate it. And finally, last point I want to make here is evolve your architecture. I know we are under pressure. When you're hired to be an architect, hey, what's the architecture? Have the courage to say, I don't know. They say, what do you mean you don't know? We hired you to create this. Seriously, I don't know. Why? Because we haven't understood the requirements yet. We need to take the time to understand it. So develop the architecture, but place a percentage of confidence you have on it. We got 10% confidence on this, 20% as of now, based on what we know so far. And we're going to work together as a team to improve that confidence over time. So the confidence in architecture should increase with the knowledge of the application. Otherwise, it's a fallacy. And now we are committing to things we decided, not because they are good, it's because we committed, which is even worse. So these are approaches you can take to use things like tracer bullet to get a better understanding of the system and prototype it. I'll give you one example of this, just to give you non-programming example, just to illustrate this. I've got a son who is absolutely fascinated by the systems that you can use to visualize things, and he's big into AR. So we were building a house a couple of months ago, and we wanted to put a mirror in the bathroom. So he said, what kind of mirror do you want? I'm like, I don't know. He's like, what about a circular mirror? Heck no, I'm not going to let you put a circular mirror. How about a rectangle? How about a square? I don't know. He's like, let me show you an AR. I'm like, really? Yeah. So he puts up his phone, an iPad actually, and he's in front of the bathroom, and he's like, here's a square mirror, take a look at it. I'm seeing the bathroom with the mirror. A square mirror, I don't like it. Here's a rectangular mirror, Dad. It's okay. And he looks at me and says, Dad, can you calm down? I'm like, what do you want? I'm going to show you something, don't scream. It's like, okay. And he puts a circle mirror. And he said, take a look at it. And I look, oh my gosh, I love it. He's like, you hated it a minute ago. Yeah, because I didn't know what I was talking about. This is beautiful. And guess what we have now in the bathroom? A circle mirror. It's beautiful. But I never even imagined that would fit in there. Prototyping, visualizing, software exhibits observer effect. The minute you observe it, you want to change it, you want to evolve it. So take the liberty to prototype, to experiment, to put in place, mock things up, not mocking as in unit testing mocking, to put placeholders, evolve it and see where it goes. and then make your decision, you'll be happy to commit to things because you've seen it work. So I talked about a number of things here. Be a mentor, not a tormentor. Criticize ideas, not people. Guide, don't dictate. Practice collective ownership. Allow developers to figure it out. Focus on the outcome, not on the process. Gain domain expertise. Learn to unlearn individually and as a team. Diversify your knowledge portfolio. Lead by example. Write code. Evolve the architecture. And this is a journey, and we want to be together collectively as a team and together as well, and we can work together to do it. But that, like I said earlier, is our professional responsibility to be able to walk together as a team. But if I can, leave one thought finally with you, that would be just to say that software is an amazing practice. I started programming a few decades ago. I never thought I would continue to program till now. Often people ask me, what do you do? And I often tell them, I'm that kid in the candy store, because I get super excited. I start coding, I break things, I see everything fall apart, and I put them all back together. And when you learn through that experience, it's amazing. And then you share that with somebody else that works with you. Let them give you an insight that you didn't have, and give them the insight you have. And that's an amazing journey. And I think we're in a great field to do it. I'm sure you share that passion as well. Wish you well. Thank you.